How you guys doing? Good? I remember I came to South by Southwest the first time, I guess it would be 11 years ago. This was the year that Twitter rented out all the screens all over the convention center. This was their launch, and I remember looking at one and seeing someone tweet, "I'm looking at the Twitter screen in the Austin Convention Center," and I thought, well, that's a really stupid idea that will never work. So take everything I'm saying today with a grain of salt, because that is my level of predictive powers. There's a scene in The Great Gatsby, if you remember reading it in high school, where Jay Gatsby takes Nick Carraway to meet, they go to lunch, and he meets a man named Mayer Wolfsheim there. And Mayer Wolfsheim in the book is introduced as the man who fixes the 1919 World Series. And Nick Carraway is sort of aghast. He's this naive young man, and he's aghast. He said, I knew that someone had fixed the World Series. Can we hit the screen thing? He knew that a man had fixed the 1919 World Series, but he said the idea that he knew that the series had been fixed, but the idea that a single individual was responsible for this sort of stops him cold. He said, I thought that this had merely happened, that it was sort of the result of this inevitable chain. And this idea to meet the person who'd done this inconceivable thing is sort of his awakening as a young man. And in real life, the 1919 World Series was fixed by the Jewish gangster Arnold Rothstein. If you've seen the movie, or if you've seen the TV show Boardwalk Empire, he's one of the characters. But so the 1919 series really was fixed, and there really was a singular individual who put these events in motion. And so to me, Peter Thiel is an individual on par with that, right? One of these sort of throwback figures from a different era. Like many of you, I followed the events of 2012 to 2016, where Gawker Media was sued by the professional wrestler Hulk Hogan over an illegally recorded sex tape of him having sex with his best friend's wife. And I thought, that's plenty. That's the story right there, right? That's all of it. The idea that there was a billionaire behind the scenes putting these events in motion, and that his involvement in this story dates not to the day the Post runs in October of 2012, but in fact goes all the way back to 2007, was just incredible to me. And so when I got an email from Peter in the summer of 2016, I was like a Nick Carraway. I was fascinated by this. I wanted to find out everything that I could about it. And I, as I was sort of kicking around writing a book about it, thinking about it, I called Robert Greene, who's a friend of mine. He's the author of The 48 Laws of Power. He's been sort of a mentor in my career. And I said, Robert, I'm fascinated by this story, this sort of conspiracy. Is there anything you recommend that I read or research about it? And he told me that there was this obscure volume of Machiavelli. This is Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy. If you want to sort of think of a boring book, this is a old dead white guy writing about the book, writing about a book written by a different old dead white guy from many centuries before. And he said, but there's a chapter in it on conspiracies, and I think you would like to read it. And I read it, and there's a line in the book. Machiavelli says, a man who is forced by necessity or embarrassment to act, if you can basically, he has to choose between acting or suffering. This man poses a dangerous threat to the prince, right? Machiavelli's chapter is sort of about these conspiracies. What drives people to do these secretive, dark, destructive things? And so I read this, I find it interesting, and a few months later, I'm actually at Peter's house. We're having dinner in New York City. I'm interviewing him for the book, and I walk in, and as an author, the first thing I do when I enter someone's house is I snoop through their bookshelves, and I'm walking in near a chess set in the corner of his apartment, which overlooks Union Square. There it is. There's Discourses on Livy by Machiavelli, and I ask him about this chapter, and he can cite from it from memory. And so to me, this was this sort of perfect intersection of these ideas. It's what made me want to write a book about this incredible series of events. And that's the inspiration. Books are often, they kicked off by inspiration, but then you have to write the damn thing, and it's not easy to do. And so I had to figure out what happened. The legal papers alone from the events of 2012 to 2016 were some 25,000 pages. I think it cost $2,000 just to have them all printed up. I reviewed those, hundreds of hours of transcripts from interviews, articles, books, etc. it took, just to show you, this is the, just the timeline of events, which date from 2002 to 2017, were 55,000 words and took about 150 pages. So I had to wrap my head around what actually happened before I could write it. And it's been this sort of fascinating journey for me. I thought maybe I'd start there. I'll sort of share with you what the hell happened, how this $300 million company was essentially wiped from the face of the internet. And what did happen, people think, it begins with a lawsuit, or maybe they think it begins with Peter Thiel being outed by Gawker in 2007. His sexuality is a sort of an open secret in the Valley, and he's outed in a, let's call it a mildly insensitive article by Valleywag titled "Peter Thiel is Totally Gay, People." This incenses him because it's both, he believes his private business. He doesn't believe that he's a public figure, and he has a point. I mean, I don't happen to know off the top of my head the sexuality of Facebook's other early investors. And 2007 is a different time as well, right? Obama hasn't yet even come out in favor of gay marriage. It would be months later that the state of California would pass a proposition that actually bans gay marriage. So 2007 is a different time, and he's incensed by this article, but in fact, this is not the beginning of the events of the conspiracy. We would have to go back just a few months before, 2007, we're in Florida. Hulk Hogan's life has fallen apart. Despite having one of the most popular reality television shows of the early 2000s, his life has fallen apart. His wife has left him or is in the process of leaving him. His son's behavior is spiraling out of control. His daughter is upset with him. He, at his lowest moment, is asked by his friend to come over, a man whose legal name is Bubba the Love Sponge. This is Hogan's best friend, a radio DJ in Florida. He comes over and he promises to cheer him up a little bit. And what results is a, let's call it an encounter with Hogan and his friend's wife, Heather Clem. They're swingers. They have an open relationship. And so Hogan has sex with his best friend's wife. And if that weren't weird enough, he doesn't know that the smoke detector on the wall, the blinking light is not to show you that it's working, but to indicate that there's a camera behind it, that hidden in the wall of his best friend's bedroom was a camera that was recording every word that he said and move that he made. And so he has this encounter, he has another encounter over a series of days, and then this sort of weird episode in his life recedes from memory. He goes back to his normal life. He has no idea that the walls of this bedroom could talk or could see. And so Peter Thiel is then outed by Gawker, and he spends the next 5 years almost just thinking about what he can do about this. We tend to live in a very reactionary society, right? You say something bad about me on Twitter, I respond to you on Twitter. You don't like what this person is doing, and so you start a petition. We're sort of very reactionary, right? And Gawker had tangled with its fair share of powerful people over the years, and those powerful people had almost immediately responded whenever this happened, right? What Peter does is different. His sort of, I guess his self-discipline, his sort of patience as an investor serves him well here. He doesn't do anything, although he gives a few comments about Gawker from time to time. He calls them the Silicon Valley equivalent of Al-Qaeda. He's in fact just sort of plotting his next move. He tries a number of things. He hires a man named Eddie Hayes. If you've read Bonfire of the Vanities, Eddie Hayes appears in the book. He's Tom Wolfe's friend and lawyer. Eddie Hayes is the notorious New York City fixer. He's also in the movie Goodfellas, and he's Robert De Niro's lawyer in real life. His slogan is, "I can get you out of anything." And so Peter hires him to explore what sort of options, what sort of recourse he might have. He arranges a number of sort of secret cloak and dagger meetings with former Gawker writers. One of the writers would say that Peter questions him. He says, why would these people say this about me? Why would they do this? And then he asks, why would anyone write about anyone at all? It's sort of this weird, he has trouble just comprehending why this site does what it does, how it operates. There's a sort of a naivete in him in this regards. And sort of as he studies and familiarizes himself with this outlet, he becomes more and more horrified. He would say later, the more I studied them, the harder it was to find good. They out his boyfriend. They run a number of negative stories at him. Friends would tell me they believe that he was sort of affected by this personally, but also worried about it financially and professionally, right? If you own 10% of Facebook pre-IPO, what could one negative story from a blog cost you potentially? Not just tens of millions of dollars, but hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially even billions of dollars. So this media outlet represents sort of a threat to him, both existentially and economically, and he despairs of what he can do about it. He talks with fellow billionaire Sean Parker, and could we just buy Gawker and shut it down? The Gawker was not for sale, so this wasn't a viable option. And so he comes to this conclusion that there's really nothing you can do about it. He said that I began to internalize what I heard from other people, that when it came to Gawker, there was nothing you could do. And to a certain extent, they were right. Outing someone is not technically illegal. It might be in very bad taste. It might be cruel and thoughtless, but it's not illegal. And so he despairs of doing anything about it until in 2011, he sits down in a restaurant in Berlin with a young man who I refer to in the book as Mr. A. Mr. A is the piece of the puzzle that had not yet been reported until the book comes out. But Mr. A sees in Gawker and in Peter's frustration with Gawker an opportunity. And he pitches as if it is a startup idea. He says, look, I think I know how to solve your Gawker problem. Peter had started calling Gawker the MBTO, the Manhattan-based terrorist organization. So again, this is an indication of the extremeness of his feelings about it. But then you contrast it with the fact that 4 years have passed and he hasn't done anything until he's sitting across from this 26-year-old kid who's basically done nothing in his life except for graduate from law school. And he pitches him this idea. He says, look, I think we can start a shell company. I think we can hire lawyers and private investigators who can find in Gawker's catalog and their archive of, at that point, close to 1 million articles. I think we can find legitimate causes of action. We can find things they did to other people, whether it's a copyright violation, an invasion of privacy, slander, or defamation. We can find things that they've done that have crossed the line. We can fund lawyers to take down this company. And on the spot, Peter gives this kid a budget, an open-ended budget of roughly $10 million. He's patient, but then at the same time very decisive. This is the same guy who gives an unproven Mark Zuckerberg $500,000 and turns it into Facebook. And with this kid, he gives him $10 million and an approximate timeline of 3 to 5 years to see if he can solve the problem of the MBTO. And they end up hiring a lawyer in Los Angeles named Charles Harder, who had up till this point represented celebrities in relatively mundane cases like getting their domain name back from squatters or small copyright violations. And Mr. A is Thiel's representative in these discussions. So they hire Charles Harder, but Charles Harder doesn't know who his actual client is. Mr. A represents himself as representing a conspiracy of business people who are looking to fund cases of action or causes of action against Gawker, but they remain nameless. And so for the next year, they simply comb through Gawker's archives looking for something, looking for some cause, some client, some person who would be willing to sort of go the distance against Gawker, which, by the way, Peter is not personally willing to do, right? He wants to remain anonymous. And they don't find anything that immediately stands out until October of 2012, when Gawker makes the unforced error of the century, a fatal unforced error, if you will, when an anonymous envelope arrives at their headquarters in Manhattan that contains that video of Hulk Hogan having sex with his best friend's wife. We would find out later, of course, that the lawyer representing the person who leaks the tape is a man named Keith M. Davidson, if that name sounds vaguely familiar. He's also the lawyer of the 2 porn stars who are currently in the process of suing Donald Trump after after their confidentiality agreement. So it's actually the same playbook, right? What the lawyer does is he leaks tapes to media outlets. In this case, Gawker. They would admit later that the leak to Gawker was the shot across the bow. It's the first tape that's designed to get attention. And then he calls Hulk Hogan and his attorney, and he says, look, would you like to buy the other 2 tapes that I'm in possession of? Would you like to make sure that no one else sees them? So if we back up for a second, because it actually gets even weirder than just Donald Trump's personal nemesis shaking down Hulk Hogan. How did these tapes get public in the first place? Who's doing this? It's actually not Bubba Clem. This story tends to take the weirdest possible turn it can take at every moment. What happened was, so Bubba Clem, Bubba the Love Sponge, records the tapes. He and his wife both know about them. Actually, they subsequently get divorced, and the possession of the tapes is something that's litigated in their divorce. Who gets the illegally recorded sex tapes that we made in our bedroom? Bubba gets them and decides to lock them in a drawer in his desk at his studio in Tampa. And during a move, the drawer is left unlocked. And as far as we can ascertain, a rival DJ, another crappy Florida DJ, steals the tapes. And aside from seeing that they might have some financial worth because Hulk Hogan is mortified by them, he is actually seeing them as a way to embarrass his rival DJ, Bubba the Love Sponge, by showing him to be a cuck, as the word has now entered the lexicon. But he wants to, it's not actually attempting to embarrass Hulk Hogan. He's attempting to embarrass a DJ whose time slot he would like. And so this entire series of events that involve the FBI, a billionaire, a $300 million media company, a number of First Amendment implications, is actually set into motion by one greedy Florida shock jock trying to embarrass another Florida media shock jock. And so the tapes that they leak, Gawker runs them. The story is so unremarkable in their eyes, so typical for a Gawker story, that there's some argument over whether the publisher, Nick Denton, the founder, is even alerted to the tape's existence before they run. Gawker gets a good scoop, they run it. That's what they do. The fact that Hogan had said loudly beforehand, as the rumors of these tapes had swirled about, that he planned to sue anyone that ran them. The day Gawker ran them, they get one cease and desist order explaining the backstory of the tapes and asking them to be removed. And then a second one goes directly to Nick Denton, where Hogan pleads as a human being, he says, to understand what this tape is and to please take it down. And Gawker declines. They run the story. Ultimately, it's viewed approximately 7 million times. Thousands, tens of thousands of hours of cumulative watching of this 1 minute and 41 second tape. Gawker advertises it as the heavyweight champion of all celebrity sex tapes, actually. So Hogan has said very loudly that he plans to sue anyone that runs the tapes. But the reality is he would have been almost immediately incapable of doing so, as Thiel would say later in words that only a billionaire could utter. Hogan is only a single-digit millionaire, and therefore incapable of actually litigating a case against a media outlet for any length. Gawker had been sued many times before. No one had gotten even to the discovery phase, let alone to the trial phase. They have an insurance buffer. Basically, insurance pays for the first $1 million of legal costs. And so essentially, Hogan is effectively, has no access to the legal system in this case. He can threaten to sue, but could he have actually sued and won? Probably not. But this is the case that Mr. A and Charles Harder and Peter Thiel and the conspiracy had actually been waiting for. This is the exact kind of thing they were looking for, right? Although later it would come to be seen as a First Amendment battle. In fact, it's both a copyright violation. You can't just run a sex tape, just like you can't run a video of anything that someone runs without their permission. And it's potentially an invasion of privacy, which Thiel was looking for. Does the media, does the public have the right to access to footage recorded inside a private bedroom and that's the debate, right? So Thiel funds this lawsuit. They sue Gawker in late October for $100 million. The legal battle then takes another 4 years before they get to the verdict. What's fascinating about it is that for much of this process, there's a line from Machiavelli where it says that conspiracies are split into 3 parts. He says there's the planning, the doing, and the aftermath. So we could say that the planning phase of this conspiracy, it really gets started with the hiring of Mr. A, and then it ends with the filing of the lawsuit in 2012. And then the doing happens, and this period would typically, in an ordinary conspiracy, be the briefest part. But in this conspiracy, it transpires over the next 4 years. Gawker is a media outlet. They take these claims very seriously. They have excellent lawyers on retainer, and they fight this lawsuit tooth and nail because, they think they're fighting Hulk Hogan. And so they litigate every single motion. They appeal every ruling. They take their time. Their thinking is that why would a celebrity want to litigate a case as embarrassing as this one? Who would want to be in the headlines over and over again for having sex with your best friend's wife? Who would want their private life dredged up even more in the discovery process? And who could afford to do this? Who could afford to spend $10 million litigating a case with an uncertain outcome? And so Gawker's view is that, of course, this case will settle. Potentially it will be dropped. Eventually Hogan will tire out. And they didn't realize that Thiel had essentially been tag-teamed in and was waiting in the shadows there. And so the lawsuit worms its way through the Florida courts. As it happens, there's a thing in Florida called the supersedis bond, which says if you lose a case, to be able to appeal the final verdict, you have to post a bond of either the entire verdict or a cap of $50 million. And so Thiel realizes that if they can win, it will be almost certainly a bankruptcy-inducing event for Gawker. They don't have $50 million in the bank. And so he knows just to keep going. There's a pivotal moment in the conspiracy, in their sort of pursuit of Gawker, where they get to the deposition phase. If you've ever been in a deposition, the first question they ask you is, have you been deposed in this matter or any other similar matter in the past? And all of Gawker's team is deposed. Its founder, the editor who runs the story, its strategy officers, other editors, its advertising people, and they're all deposed. And their answer to that first question is across the board no. And so actually Thiel, when he gets the printouts of all these depositions, this is a big breakthrough moment of the conspiracy. He realizes that this is a company that had received, they said, so many cease and desist orders. At one point in the trial, Charles Harder asked Gawker to turn over all the cease and desists that they've experienced in the company's history. And their lawyer pleads that this is so many, they've received so many cease and desists, it would literally be humanly impossible to compile them all, right? That it would take too long for them to do so. They said that the collected legal works of Gawker could fill a book, is what she says in the course of this. And so the idea that they'd received all these cease and desists, that they'd been sued a great number of times, but they'd never actually proceeded to the deposition or the discovery phase. This is this breakthrough moment for Thiel because he realizes that no one has actually tried this before. And if you've studied or heard much from Peter Thiel, he likes to do the things that other people have never done before. He likes what he calls terra incognita. He likes fresh ground, virgin territory. And so he said, we'd gotten to step 3 of our conspiracy, and we realized that we'd gotten the furthest that anyone had gotten before. And he realizes then that if they can just not quit, if they can just keep going, inevitably they will get one of these cases to a jury, and they will win. And he's not content simply to leave it at Hulk Hogan. They pursue a number of other cases. They find, for instance, in the process that Gawker had an unpaid internship program and that Gawker had hypocritically criticized other media companies for not paying interns. So they hand this case to another lawyer who files suit on behalf of these interns. This case takes itself something like 3 years. It cost Gawker over $1 million in legal fees. And they're sort of bloodied in public opinion. They're seen not as the good guys anymore. They're seen as these hypocrites. Gamergate, if you remember this, in 2014, is sort of, we have to be careful about how we insinuate things, but it is certainly an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation for Thiel. We see, again, people beginning to gang up on Gawker, the previously invincible company is now sort of stumbling a bit. I would talk to one famous Gamergater, and he would compare Gamergate to that scene in the movie 300 where the Spartans throw this spear and it grazes Xerxes' cheek, and they realize that the king is a man and not a god. The sort of blood was in the water, so to speak. And so this conspiracy is in some ways nasty business, right? It's not just this one case that they hope to win in open court, but a number of sort of distracting, exhausting, attrition tactics that are wearing this company down, this company that had never gotten this far, that had never actually fought a legal battle, that had never gotten in front of a jury, is being slowly worn down by Thiel, who again it's an asymmetric fight because Thiel is secret and is not known. And so by 2015 and early 2016, the case is on the verge of trial, and Thiel spends six figures on a number of jury consultants. What they find is that this case of revenge porn or invasion of privacy, they find that one type of juror is particularly sympathetic to their argument, and so they find that demographic is overweight women. So they profile the jury, right? In the jury selection, the actual trial, if you look, 3 of the 6 jurors are overweight women. And again, this is another thing that Gawker is sort of not aware of when it's happening. They think this is, you're faced with a jury of your peers. They didn't realize that they would be having to justify the running of this sex tape not to a number of bloggers in Manhattan or people who work in the media business. They were in front of working mothers in Florida who didn't understand this Facebook thing and didn't like it very much, right? So it's when Gawker finally gets in front of that jury, I think it's then for the first time that they realize how badly they've misunderstood this fight that they were in, that Hogan is the hero, that people in this courtroom don't particularly care about the potential First Amendment rights of a media outlet to run an illegally recorded sex tape. In fact, they find this to be disturbing. There's at the opening of AJ's article, he has a line. He says, "We like to watch celebrity sex tapes because we are a society of shameless voyeurs." And in the closing arguments for Gawker, one of the interesting moments is that instead of having Charles Harder, this Los Angeles attorney, from Beverly Hills, make the arguments to the Florida jury, they've in fact selected a local Florida counsel to do their two lawyers from Florida to do the arguments. And in the closing arguments, this sort of beefy Florida lawyer gets up, this real good old boy, and he says, AJ says that we're all shameless voyeurs, and that's why we watch tapes. And he says, I don't know what they do up there in New York on Fifth Avenue, but here in Florida, we're not shameless voyeurs. And so it's, again, Gawker is so unprepared for what happens that when the jury sees this, they are incensed. They find this outlet to be repulsive in almost every way, and the verdict reflects that. There is one moment where we think the jury might be merciful. As they go into deliberations, one of the jurors asks if community service is one of their potential punishments that they can offer, and the judge says, no, I'm sorry, this is not that kind of case. And so the jury comes back in less than 6 hours, $140 million in Hogan's favor. It's immediately a bankruptcy-inducing event for Gawker, and they lose. They don't have $50 million. They don't have $140 million, and they are forced to declare bankruptcy. It's only 2 months later that this would be the aftermath, right? That's the story ends with the verdict. But the aftermath is 2 months later. Thiel is unmasked in his role. He'd been so secret, he'd been so disciplined for 9 years. Nobody knew his involvement. But he'd come to become quite proud of what he'd done, and he would talk about it at dinner. He would hint at it. And eventually the circle got large enough that he would be discovered. And Forbes breaks the story. We could argue that Thiel's main mistake here is not just the overconfidence, but that he doesn't have a plan for this. The conspiracies are almost always poorly planned in the post-execution phase, in the aftermath. Thiel doesn't realize, despite being warned by his friends, that it would, although Gawker may have been seen as the bully up and through the trial, as soon as they lose, now they're the sympathetic one. And Hogan would tell me that he regretted not seeing it either. He would say, in my wrestling days, I would, oftentimes I would be winning, I'd be beating an opponent, and the crowd would be cheering for me. But I might deliver one or two many fake kicks to that opponent on the ground, and the crowd would turn. And that's what happens here. Shortly after the verdict, the New York Times runs a series of op-eds where they say there's basically no negative precedent for this case whatsoever, that it just means that websites can't run celebrity sex tapes, particularly stolen ones. But once Thiel's identity is revealed, suddenly it takes on a much more ominous tone and sends a more ominous message. What does it mean that a billionaire can destroy a media outlet? But the truth is, litigation funding is rather common, right? No one says, what does it mean that the ACLU can fund this case? What does that mean for society? We generally think that's a good thing. But the optics change irrevocably as soon as one powerful person beats the other powerful person, because now who the underdog is switches, right? Thiel now looks like the bully, even though Gawker had bullied him many years previously. So the story ends, or we think it ends, except it's impossible to separate one conspiracy from another, or one decision from another. And so in that courtroom, Thiel sees this sort of anger against the elites, this sort of backlash against the media, and he would say that this inspires him to back Donald Trump in the 2016 election. This is going on as I'm interviewing him, so I sort of watched this process unfold, and it was particularly interesting because he set out to protect his privacy and becomes incredibly famous as a result. He comes to try to stop bullying and ends up empowering one of the great cyber bullies of our time. He wants to stop this sort of mob mentality on the internet, and somehow ends up empowering Gamergate and the alt-right and this number of trolls who are in many ways the opposite of Peter Thiel, despite whatever ideological alignment there might be. Thiel has a house in Maui where he spends a good deal of his time, and Maui happens to have one of the great examples of unintended consequences of all time that I think aligns well with what happened here. In Maui, they had a rat problem. The sailors came, they introduced rats to this island. There's not any real predators for these rats. And so some genius decides we need to introduce some species that can eat the rats. And so they introduce a species of mongoose to Hawaii. And they just didn't bother to check that rats are nocturnal and mongoose are diurnal. And so they don't solve the rat problem, they create a rat and a mongoose problem. And so there's some argument that this conspiracy follows a similar inevitable trajectory, that a man sets out to do something to solve one problem and ends up unleashing a greater or a more complicated problem as well. If we can show that slide really fast. The epigraph to this book is a quote from Walker Percy. It's a man who basically gets fed up. He says, I've had enough. He says, I can't stand this age. I won't stand this age. And he said, and that's what I learned. I didn't have to. And so it's a fascinating story because on the one hand here, it's a book about a man who does stand up to the dangers of his age. But the subtext of the book is that the man might be insane. And that it ends with him in prison for having burnt his house down and killed everyone that he loves. And so to me, this book this story is a sort of a twisted, timeless, almost Shakespearean story. You have a man who is bullied, who tries to stand up to this bully, and does he become the bully in the process? We don't know. It's a story of poetic justice, the idea that you could go out and pick enemies, as Gawker often did, sort of pick fights for attention, and that there would never be any consequences for those actions is an element of this story. The idea that although Gawker ends up being hopelessly outmatched, and this catastrophic verdict is delivered against it is part of it. And then the irony is that up until they got in front of that jury in Florida, they thought they were winning. They thought they were slowly squeezing Hulk Hogan until he would eventually have to tap out. And in turn, it was actually them who were being beaten. They just didn't know it yet. And then the methodical, deliberately planned conspiracy, so expertly done, is followed by the rush to judgment, the empowerment of Donald Trump, the opportunistic grab, right? It was interesting. So Thiel gives Trump $1.25 million, and it in some ways helps propel him into the White House. What would $1.25 million donated to the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016 have gotten you? Probably like a sweatshirt or something, right? But Thiel ends up running Trump's transition, and then does he come to rue this decision? He's back and forth. He's privately predicted to people that the Trump presidency will end in disaster, and yet he's also gotten things from it, but it is also has and will define his legacy forever. So we have the methodical, well-planned conspiracy of patience, of interior ethics, and then we have the opportunistic moment, and which ends up working better for him, which reflects more poorly on him. And so the end of the book for me is this idea that a conspiracy, this idea of coordinated, deliberate, methodical action, sort of a ruthless exercise in power, of exploiting and finding leverage. This is neutral. The word conspiracy is neutral, but its usage is not. How one decides to use these conspiratorial ends is up to them, and then it's up to history to judge how these things go. And so, to me, I think the final lesson that I took from studying Thiel in this series of events was at least there was some competence there. I think one of the interesting arguments about Trump is, could he have, did he conspire with Russia to fix the election? And the argument from a good number of people is simply he wasn't capable of conspiring. He just couldn't have done it if he wanted to, which I'm not sure is particularly reassuring if you think about it. But so the idea of getting one's hands dirty, of sort of acting in secret, but ultimately changing the world to the world you want it to be is to me some level of inspiration, or at least reassurance. Thiel, I would talk to Thiel about conspiracies, and he would say that we're a world awash in conspiracy theories, but we have very few old-fashioned conspiracies. And he should say this should alarm us. If no one is coming to save us, if there's no one operating behind the scenes, it means that this is all there is and that we're stuck. And I thought that was an interesting perspective. Thiel is always contrarian. He always somehow finds a different way of altering one's perspective, of looking at something from a fresh lens. So ultimately, to me, that's the lesson to take from this story. The thing to mull over and think about is why don't we have more conspiracies? And if we don't know how they work, if we're like Nick Carraway and we naively think that these things simply happen and that individuals can't influence or direct or change them, are we not also defenseless against them? So thank you, appreciate it. That's the book. It looks like we got some time for questions, so I've got them here, and then you can also just walk up to the microphones if you want, I think. So someone said, what was the most challenging part when researching for and writing your book? Well, you know, what was so fascinating to me is this is a story that was incredibly well reported, right? It headlines, multiple articles in every major media outlet on the planet, and yet nobody knew the existence of this Mr. A. No one knew Thiel's involvement. So really sort of getting to the bottom of a story that so many people had sifted through was probably the toughest part. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I've owned and have read about everything you've written
on thank you.
Stoicism. And so I would be really interested how your practice in Stoicism maybe caused you to approach the story, and or did you see lessons in the story that reminded you of some of the Stoic writings?
There's a play by the Stoic Seneca called Thyestes, which is one of his darker plays, and it's a play of two brothers who are feuding, and one brother gets revenge on the other brother by murdering his children and feeding them to his brother unknowingly. So there's and it's this sort of dark story of twisted power and revenge and what it does to people. It's not in any way aligned with Stoicism, but there is this sort of artistic element of Stoicism that probes the sort of depths of and darkness of humanity. I think there's an element of that in this story, right? I mean, to spend so much of your life and so much of your money pursuing something that, even if it had some positive impact, probably that time and money could have been, you know, better spent towards other things. But I found that my job as a writer in this story was to capture what happened as clearly and cleanly as possible without judgment, and then leave it to the reader and to the world to make their judgment. I think part of the problem was that so many people have so strong opinions about whether this should have happened or not that they don't actually understand what factually happened. And the Stoics, I think, would say you start with what factually happened before you make a judgment about it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Bridget.
Yeah.
My question is, what do you see this case, what precedent has been set going forward with Gawker losing this case as far as the journalism world and writers out there, news outlets, especially in the fake news media climate that we're in right now?
I actually think its sort of legal precedent is much less alarming than many people have reported. I think the media sees itself as like the sort of canary in the coal mine as far as authoritarianism and freedom go. And so they're very alarmed by what happened, which is good. That's their job. But I think the reason that no other media outlet has had this happen to them is that very few media outlets run illegally recorded sex tapes, ignore cease and desist orders, and then litigate the case endlessly despite actually being on relatively shaky legal ground. I think Gawker had never really been challenged before, and therefore sort of had come to believe that there was no line. Right, in 2015, they out another gay man, an executive at Condé Nast, and it's only then when there's this overwhelming public backlash that they realize, oh wait, maybe we can't just get away with everything. And so I think one of the precedents is like, look, there is a line, and that line is two adults consensually having sex inside a bedroom should not have to worry about being recorded and then that broadcast to millions of people. If Gawker had merely written about what happened, I don't think we'd be standing here talking. Thiel might have found another case and still have won the same way, but in this specific instance, I think that the First Amendment implications are pretty overblown. One question here is, why did Peter not show up for this event as originally planned? I was supposed to interview him on stage to talk about it. I'll let him answer that. I don't have a good answer, but I would venture to guess the fact that this case is still not completely wrapped up. There's some argument as to whether Gawker has claims against Thiel for destroying its business, for setting out to destroy its business. I find that those claims, again, probably a bit overblown given that his case is won, but it may have been that he didn't want to comment publicly on a legal matter that everyone expected to be wrapped up by March of 2018, given that the verdict was March of 2016. Go ahead.
So, based on the story as you tell it, it sounds like a story was written about an aspect of Peter Thiel's life that he worked hard to keep private, and then Peter Thiel set out to destroy the person who wrote it. And then in response, you wrote a book about a part of Peter Thiel's life that he set out to keep private. Did you ever worry that this might be a really bad idea?
Yes, many, many times. I mean, I thought it was a bad idea just because it was really hard for a long time, too. I mean, every writer, I think, gets about 20% of the way into a book and is like, it would have been better not to write this. Like, this would be way more fun not to be writing this book right now. But yeah, my agreement with Thiel, I'm the only person that he was willing to speak to on the record about the book, about the events of what happened. Our agreement was that he would get to see nothing that I was writing. He would have no input on the writing. He could simply tell me the story, and I would do my best to be fair. And he could see the book after it came off the printer for the first time. So after it was done, after it looked, like this. He got this copy of the book, right? I would say that those were some very nerve-wracking days in between when it shipped from the printer and arrived at Thiel's house. I'm not sure. When someone has just spent millions of dollars destroying an outlet that has much better legal representation than I could ever dream of, that was very nerve-wracking. But I think I haven't been sued yet, so we're good. But who knows? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm wondering if you spoke with Nick Denton in writing this book, and if you found him a sympathetic or interesting character in this story.
I've spoken extensively with Nick. Actually, he spoke at South by last year, and he came and visited my farm. I live about 30 minutes from here, and we spent some time together. I find Nick and Peter to be two of the most sort of distinct, outsized individuals of our time, and perhaps that's what put them on this collision course of conflict with each other. It's like the proverbial town wasn't big enough for the two of them. And I found them to be, I had some preconceived notions when I started, and I found them to be both, I found both of them to be much more sympathetic and much more interesting than I would have guessed. Look, there is, at one point, Nick Denton had to rent out his loft in Manhattan to cover the mortgage when his assets were frozen in the bankruptcy phase of things. And so, whether he should have, his site should have published the article or not, when you're sort of forced from your own home, there is, I think, real sympathy in that, to go from owning a $300 million company to not owning that company anymore, and to worry whether those people are going to be put out of work. I mean, this was his, I say in the beginning of the book, this was a story of a billionaire who set out to destroy the life's work of a millionaire. Whether that millionaire's life work was good for society or not is sort of secondary to the fact that would be a very tough thing to go through. Go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to preface this with, I'm a huge fan of yours.
Okay.
Huge fan of Peter Thiel.
All right.
But you paint him in the book as a sort of Aspergian guy who, is setting out against bullying. But everything he does, he does with a wink. Think of the name Palantir.
Yes.
I mean, do you think he might have been playing you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think he enjoys playing the villain a little bit. I think that's one of the secret pleasures that he's taken from this, that he now sort of has this reputation as like a James Bond villain. I think he likes that. I think it keeps his life interesting, and I do think he likes both. The irony is that both Thiel and Gawker really enjoy, and in fact, seek out saying and thinking the things you're not supposed to say and think. But I think, hopefully in this book, what I tried to capture in him was his intensity and his unique way of thinking and his power. I mean, he's one of the most powerful people powerful sort of non-governmental people in the world right now, right? He's worth billions of dollars. He sits on the board of the most powerful social network in the world. He's the majority shareholder of this secretive, incredibly large defense company. He has power on the scale of a Carnegie or a Rockefeller or a Vanderbilt, and he's willing to use it. I think he thinks he's using it for good, and I tend to agree with some of the stuff that he does and not others. But I think I accurately captured that power and what it does to a person. Go ahead.
Ryan, first, I want to say thanks for being here, and on your note about James Bond villains, perhaps Peter's recent move to LA is foreshadowing a role there in the next Bond film.
Yeah, maybe.
So I'm Jordan French, editor at The Street. We can catch up later. I was curious, though, after writing Conspiracy, if you had a strong comment on Mike Masnick's situation over at Takedown, which has some analogies to Gawker, especially in the way it reports, and vis-a-vis Sxsw, the Senate candidate, who seemed to have taken a chunk, at least according to the facts that I know, in Gawker's situation, but had a recent big loss against Masnick. Do you have any comment on that?
Is this the email, the guy who claims to have invented email and is suing Takedown? Yeah, so he sued, one of the plaintiffs that Thiel represents or Charles Harder, who's Thiel's attorney, represents in this pursuit of Gawker, is a man who claims to have invented email, and Gawker wrote an article or a number of articles that claimed that he didn't. I would say that of all the cases, that one strikes me as probably being the least compelling. I don't think that I'm not sure he would have won. Who knows? I mean, the case never really got sort of to discovery in the Gawker matter. Maybe there's some sort of smoking gun that I'm not aware of. But I would say what's interesting about his case in this trial is that after Thiel in 2016, as the case is going to trial and the Hogan case is really looking good, Thiel and Harder take on a number of these other clients, including Sxsw. And I would say that the convergence of all these cases involving the same lawyer at the same time is probably what prompted Thiel's unmasking. I think it was just too many cases, too close together for people not to poke around. So I don't have any comments on the case itself, but I would say it probably was a mistake in retrospect to have represented it. Let's see what we got. So once Thiel seized on the Hulk Hogan case and decided to pursue it, was there anything Gawker could have done to protect themselves, which they missed or ignored? This is a fascinating question. I think I think two things. So one, I think Gawker's legal strategy was fundamentally flawed from the outset. They never defended, essentially their legal argument was, we can publish anything we want, and this case falls under that. So there was never really a strong argument that this case was actually newsworthy, this tape was actually newsworthy. They never really had done any research when they published in the first place, which sort of undermined that argument. But the idea that I think if Gawker had tried to make itself sympathetic rather than fully in the right, the jury might have interpreted their actions differently. So for instance, if Gawker had said, look, we've apologized to Hulk Hogan. We've taken this article down. We've tried to settle this case a dozen times. You know, if their argument had come from a place of if they had made themselves the little guy rather than the big guy, I think that perhaps it would have been conceived of differently. And I think they made themselves so unsympathetic that the jury really had no choice but to rule against them. I would say the other part of this was just not. I think early on they could have settled the case had they wanted to, but they didn't think that they needed to. Ultimately, Hogan was the one who got to decide whether the case would settle or not. And I think if they'd offered him, a good chunk of money in 2012 or 2013, or they'd been willing to apologize or take the post down, escalated to the level that it escalated to.
Yeah, that was the question I asked. So just as a follow-up to that, do you think at any point, and just based on what you're saying now, they didn't really pursue, a settlement? Do you think at any point they they potentially realized that they had someone bigger behind no return. They
Yeah.
was too far gone and they really couldn't do anything?
So the settlement offers creep as high as $10+ million. But one of the reasons that they turn them down is not only for, so typically if you've paid legal bills, you've done it with a contingency arrangement with the lawyer, you incentivize, take your money off the table and walk away. The fact that Thiel was a situation for Hogan where it was sort of all upside and very little downside, right? He's not out anything if he loses. Gawker would say later that they had suspected someone, but their legal strategy doesn't really reflect it. So maybe they suspected it, but they wouldn't admit it to themselves. During the trial, about a week in, there was an article by a small law blog that speculated whether someone was paying Hogan's legal bills. And even then, I think it got like 20 likes on Facebook, right? It just was mostly ignored. I think Gawker was so worried about seeming like, it sounds crazy to go like, oh, actually a secretive billionaire is funding Hulk Hogan's case. Like, I think they were worried about being portrayed as ridiculous, that they almost convinced themselves that what they were thinking and seeing wasn't real, and that if they could have settled the case and known that Thiel was behind it, that would have been the right thing to do. It's like it never lined up in the right way at the right time. So maybe we got time for one more if anyone's got one. I'll do it here if not. What's the difference between a conspiracy and a business objective? Yeah, this is the fundamental question of the book. Is this a conspiracy? Is it just a straightforward lawsuit? To me, the elements here of secrecy is a huge part. The elements of finding some sort of, weakness, right? It's the equivalent of taking down Al Capone for tax evasion, or finding the exhaust vent in the Death Star, right? Typically, a conspiracy has to find an unexplored or undefended weakness. Machiavelli said that states can afford to war each other. When they're hopelessly outmatched, has to rely on conspiracy. So to me, this idea of leverage is instrumental. And then ends, I think, have to be controversial or disruptive to the status quo. One doesn't, you don't conspire to go down to the store to get a gallon of milk. It has to be some sort of goal that people might reject or be upset, that you couldn't get upfront consent for, I think is part of it. So to me, a conspiracy is sort of a combination of all these factors. And then, of course, a conspiracy theory is just a speculation about these things. And so I say in the book, conspiracy theories are legion, but here is like an actual conspiracy that we know for a fact happened, that the people who were involved were willing to admit and go on the record about. So thank you guys for coming. This was very cool. I appreciate it.